Hello, viewers. Welcome to the Common Caveat. I am your host, Matthew Sabatine. And if you are intrigued by the soul and the mysteries of faith, then join me as we explore the relevance of Jesus Christ to our understanding of consciousness, culture, psychobiology, and the spiritual experiences we encounter. I always like to read multiple books and cross-reference them. Sometimes they complement each other, sometimes they contradict each other. So for this episode, I want to discuss The Master and His Emissary, written by psychiatrist Eben McGilchrist. Chapter 3 discusses language and its relationship with meaning and the two hemispheres of the brain. I find this relevant to telepathic messages said to have occurred during near-death experiences discussed by neurosurgeon Eben Alexander's book called Proof of Heaven and psychiatrist Bruce Greyson's book called After. It seems that we tend to assume that meaningful communication cannot occur without language and words. We assume that if something cannot be explained with the most precise and satisfactory words, it is better to conclude that the thing in question does not exist. That assumption is wrong, according to Chapter 3 of Dr. McGilchrist's book. But before we get to that, I want to briefly discuss Dr. Alexander's near-death experience. Dr. Alexander fell into a 7-day coma after being afflicted with acute bacterial meningoencephalitis, as he describes it. Page 29 of his book, Proof of Heaven, tells us that he was in a disembodied state during his journey to a place of pulsing, pounding darkness, as he describes it. He goes on, quote, "At the time, I might have called it primordial, but at the time it was going on, I didn't know this word. In fact, I didn't know any words at all. The words used here registered much later when, back in the world, I was writing down my recollections, language, emotion, logic. These were all gone, as if I had regressed back to some state of being from the very beginnings of life, as far back perhaps as the primitive bacteria that, unbeknownst to me, had taken over my brain and shut it down." End quote. He mentions a monotonous mechanical pounding, as he describes it, that accompanied him for what felt like eons, which was finally eradicated by a light appearing in the darkness and the sound of beautiful music. Then he was whisked away into another indescribably awesome place. He was flying over a rural area full of trees and waterfalls. For Dr. Alexander, this otherworldly paradise was ineffably real. However, the word real is unsatisfactorily abstract that might be clarified with his analogy. So, imagine yourself as a kid seeing an entertaining movie during a summer day, only to later feel the gorgeous weather outside and wonder why you wasted your time in the dark theater. Quoting Dr. Alexander on page 39, he says, "Multiply that feeling 1,000 times and you still won't be anywhere close to what it felt like where I was." End quote. At some point, he realized he was in the presence of an attractive girl with prominent cheekbones and blue eyes, adorned in clothing with colors of, quote, powder blue, indigo, and pastel orange peach, end quote, that had a powerful lifelike quality blending in with their surroundings. Finally, he relays what happened next, saying, quote, "Without using any words, she spoke to me. The message went through me like a wind, and I instantly understood that it was true. I knew so in the same way that I knew that the world around us was real, was not some fantasy passing and insubstantial," end quote. That can be found on pages 40 and 41 of his book. Dr. Alexander, Eben Alexander, is not the only medical professional to write about this issue. Dr. Raymond Moody's 1975 book titled Life After Life is consistent with this story of wordless communication. In his chapter on the experience of dying and ineffability, he quotes a near-death experiencer who realizes she is limited by the language of our three-dimensional world while trying to describe the multi-dimensional world she experienced. Pages 134 and 135 of Dr. Bruce Greyson's book called After, he relays the story of Christine wrecking her husband's Volkswagen bus with her friend Barbara in the passenger seat and hurling both of them through the windshield. While traveling on a dirt trail in a heavenly place of omnipresent serenity and affection, Barbara receives Christine's telepathic request to tell her husband David that she will always love him. These stories of an otherworldly spiritual realm or realms that transcend human words are largely rejected by the worldview of reductive materialism. This philosophy of reductive materialism is a version of the world that McGilchrist says is dominated by the brain's left hemisphere, that prefers to perceive the world in terms of what it can grab and get, as opposed to seeing things in their broader picture or context. Although McGilchrist, Grayson, and Moody do not, to my knowledge, share my belief that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father, I still appreciate their appreciation of the spiritual aspects of these things. The Master and his Emissary, among McGilchrist's other lectures, support the premise that the demotion and dismissal of religion and the sacred has its parallels with the decline of music and poetry, because they are perceived as peripheral or useless for truth-telling. We assume that only strict and analytical language can accomplish truth-telling from the perspective of the left hemisphere, despite language being distributed across both hemispheres. McGilchrist questions the popular opinion that the enlargement of the left hemisphere was vital for language development, in light of the fossil record revealing brain asymmetry in primitive humans. Virtual three-dimensional models have analyzed and quantified antero-posterior endocranial asymmetries between modern humans, great apes, and fossil hominins, as reported in 2012 by the scientific journal called PLOS ONE. The left side predominance of the planum temporale, which is associated with language in humans, was also found in chimpanzees in 1998. The successful communication of non-human primates without linguistics should make us question language as the monopolizer of truth. Some people might try to argue that language evolved before music and therefore had more time to refine its truth-telling skills. But McGilchrist casts doubt on language predating music in light of the simplicity of the syntax of music compared to the complexity of the syntax of language. Children develop their syntax and vocabulary after developing the rise and fall of vocal pitch, natural flow of expression, and the patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. Newborns' sensitivity to the rhythms of language is evidenced by 3 experiments done in the late 1990s in which the infants were able to distinguish the different stress patterns in multisyllabic Italian words in spite of the varying consonants. Researchers measured this according to the infants' sucking reflex, which would intensify when they showed greater interest. The prosody or music of speech takes precedence over language in child development. This is based on a 1990 experiment involving 1-month-old and 2-day-old infants to see how long they would look at a visual cue that was paired with infant-directed speech versus adult-directed speech. Both age groups expressed preference for infant-directed speech. The study suggested that this preference is inborn despite whatever happens after birth, although prenatal auditory occurrences could influence this. McGilchrist remarks on page 103, quote, "These capacities for distinguishing the characteristic inflections of a language or even of an individual speaker are not signs of an inborn talent for language as such. They rely on aspects of right hemisphere holistic processing, capable of making fine discriminations in global patterns and having little to do with the analytic processing of language by the left hemisphere." End quote. For anyone who wants to defend language as the sole means of truth-telling and wants to defend that on the basis that music is not sufficiently adaptable or wide-ranging for the task, you should consider the social lives of aquatic animals. McGilchrist's source is different from mine, but mine still gets the point across. I consider the acoustic communication and cognitive abilities in cetaceans. Extended, intricate melodies are necessary for most male baleen whales that must find mates in waters with low visibility and no olfaction. Humpback whales show patterns of song change, which indicates vocal learning. All males of a population can sing in unison. Several dolphin species are able to create distinct whistles, enduring for at least a decade. The vocal learning of dolphins is evidenced by their ability to create distinct patterns of pitch variation, which they adapt from the whistles of other dolphins. Our nonverbal young can still communicate, even if they struggle with clarity. Those who have lost their language due to a left hemisphere stroke can still convey intentions and emotions, in spite of living a previous. McGilchrist cites Robin Ian MacDonald Dunbar, a British biological anthropologist, to convey the idea that as the groups of our speechless primate ancestors enlarged, body language and mutual grooming became impractical for bondings. Music could be a, quote, sort of grooming at a distance, end quote, that predates descriptive language. McGilchrist tells us on page 106, quote, it is estimated that even now over 90% of communication between humans is by nonverbal means, through body language, and perhaps especially through intonation. Communication, after all, does not only mean the kind of language we use to talk about things. Music is communication, but it speaks to us, not about things. It does not refer to a third party. It has an I-thou existence, not an I-it existence, end quote. Perhaps it is human introspection that leads us to the fallacious assumption that humans cannot think without language. Pages 106 and 107 tell us that our abilities to categorize, conceptualize, assess evidence, decide important matters, and find solutions can occur without language and the conscious awareness of its happening. Consider the problems of science that were solved without language. McGilchrist cites the example of French mathematician Henri Poincaré, who, after 15 days of trying to refute Fuchsian functions, had a sudden realization about their reality one evening while drinking black coffee and unable to sleep. Later, during an unrelated journey, he had an epiphany that these functions corresponded with non-Euclidean geometry. He felt certain about this insight, even though he couldn't substantiate it until he returned home later. Albert Einstein's letter to Jacques Hadamard reveals his reliance on visual and muscular imagery rather than written and spoken words to accomplish his work. McGilchrist comments on page 107 saying, quote, the fact that we are more aware of those times when we do think explicitly to ourselves in words and now conceive of all thought as taking place in words should not deceive us into believing that language is necessary for thought. It could even be an impediment to it. Most forms of imagination, for example, or of innovation, intuitive problem solving, spiritual thinking, or artistic creativity require us to transcend language, at least language in the accepted sense of a referential code. Most thinking, like most communication, goes on without language, end quote. The master in his Emissary goes on to cite birds, fish, and dogs as examples of non-humans being able to categorize things without language. Arithmetic is still doable for the Munduruku Amazonian tribe, who are very restricted in their vocabulary for numbers. The book expounds further on this point about communication and thought. Perhaps the philosophy of reductive materialism would like to say that evidence of hallucination and fantasy is in the wordless exchanges between Dr. Eben Alexander and the beautiful girl of brilliant colors, or Christine's telepathy with Barbara at their vehicular accident. After looking at McGilchrist's evidence for communication and meaning that can be independent from language, it does not seem far-fetched to me that a near-death experiencer could receive messages without words. In conclusion, I see parallels between the Apostle John's vision on the island of Patmos and Dr. Alexander's description of unearthly awe and love in the presence of the attractive girl. Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 through 20 tells us about John, who fell to his feet but was told to have no fear in the presence of God, described as the, quote, living one, who, quote, holds the keys to death and Hades, end quote, and is dressed in a robe and golden sash. Verses 14 through 16 go on about his head of snow-white hair, fiery eyes, bronze feet, a thunderous voice like raging waters, a right hand holding 7 stars, a sword exiting his mouth, and a face of shining, the radiant majesty of Christ that resembles violence in this context, reminds me of God's omnipotence that will vanquish evil in the end. Such intimidating imagery is counterbalanced by his command to not be afraid, which indicates to me a unity of love and omnipotence. Since there is no fear in love, God seeks to protect those who belong to him. But here is the difference between the girl of Dr. Alexander's vision and the God of the Bible. The attractive girl tells Eben, quote, there is nothing you can do wrong, end quote, while God tells John, the apostle, to not fear, but to record an account of what he sees and dispatch it to the 7 churches. Interpret that however you like, but to me, God's command to not fear in the midst of not affirming that John can do no wrong indicates to me that God loves us in spite for watching this episode of The Common Caveat. Stay tuned for more episodes. Please hit the like button and subscribe to support me and all of these endeavors to tackle the topic of God, science, and the Christian faith.